the first three I'm going to tell you about are at the Norwich bookstore, right here. This is a book by a local author about, it's called The Bobcat, and it's a novel. I have not read it, but it's just out. This next book is a pretty important book. Nicholas Christakis is a local person who also is connected with Yale. It's a very political, very smart book. He will be here. Oh, I'm sorry. The Bobcat is next week. Nicholas is the week after that. The third week after that, we have The Grifter, the Poet, and the Runaway Train, also a local author. And then I have to put these down because they're too heavy. Then I make the trip over to the new Hood, where Susan Hinman will be reading the greatest, from her book, The Greatest Madison Square Garden, Art, Scandal, and Architecture in the Gilded Age, New York. It's kind of a cool book.
Yes.
So, here's my first page of my thing. Here it is. Okay. Liza and I are very happy to welcome Laura back to the store 14 years after her last appearance. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the story of Laura and Guy Waterman, who wrote many books together while living a homesteading life in Vermont. We here at the Norwich bookstore have known Laura as both a customer and a friend for probably almost all of our 25 years in business. And in 2005, as I mentioned, she wrote, just 5 years after Guy's death, she finished her first book, all by her own book, Losing the Garden, and read from it here at the store. She's written that she never considered writing as a child, although she, growing up in Princeton, New Jersey, was a fan of books and reading. But it was not until the 1970s, when needing to bring in some money after moving to Vermont, that she and Guy began writing columns, which eventually turned into their many books. From time to time over the years, I'd see Laura here, and I'd always say, "So, Maria Callas, what's happening?" Because I'm a Maria Callas fan. And so I was really pleasantly shocked to hear about this great new book, the captivating novel of the 25 men from the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition. Drawing upon historic records, diaries, and the letters of the men who inhabited the makeshift shelter that they called Camp Clay, Laura Waterman reimagines the true story of polar explorers fighting for their lives and the sanity under dehumanizing conditions. This gripping, tragic tale of hunger, fear, and hope grew out of her meticulous research, mostly done at Dartmouth College Library Special Collections. Charles Johnson, who was one of the many people who blurbed the book, and he's the author of Ice Ship, The Epic Voyages of the Polar Adventurer Fram, said of this book, "Through Waterman's unflinching eye and evocative prose, we can see, feel, and understand what could well have occurred in so remote a time and place at the extreme of human experience." In preparation for this introduction, I was reading through a whole lot of stuff, and I came across a quote that Laura says is a favorite quote from Goethe, which is so, I think it just sums up the woman I sort of have known over the last 25 years. And I quote, "Whatever you can do or dream, you can do. Begin it. Boldness has genius and power and magic in it. Begin it now." Please welcome Laura Waterman to Norwich.
Thank you, Penny. Let's see. I'm not really used to this. There. I need to be able to see the book. Okay, I think I'll talk a little bit about the subject of this book, sort of a preview or prologue to that you won't get by the readings. So the Greely Expedition, it was in the Arctic from 1881 to 1884, and let's see. I don't know, you probably can't see this very well, but Greenland is over here. This is Ellesmere Island, and the ice as the ships were going up toward Discovery Harbor and Lady Franklin Bay was getting thicker and thicker, but they actually made it up there. They're 500 miles from the pole at that point. And okay, the expedition actually, the origins of it started in Europe in the 1870s. It was a result of the Franklin expedition, and Franklin's losing 128 of his men, and probably most of you know about that tragic loss, and that was in 1845. And over the next 30 years, people were going up to the Arctic and looking for Franklin. And many more ships were sunk and lives lost. And so these German and Austrian scientists said, time out. We need to actually study the Arctic. We need to know what we're up against when we go up there. So the idea was a number of European countries who banded together for something called the International Polar Year. And the idea was to ring the top of the Arctic, the landmass around the pole, with stations. And America actually had two. One was where I pointed out, not too, about 100 miles south of the top of Ellesmere Island. And the other one actually was at the top of Alaska. But the one that Lieutenant Greely and his men ended up in, the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, was the coldest, the least accessible, in other words, the hardest to get to, and the windiest, and definitely the most isolated. And all those factors played a big role in the result of what happened over the next 3 years. Let's see.
What year was the polar year?
It was 1882. They wanted to get up there a year ahead of time to establish their fort, actually. So I'll read a short reading of, this is the very beginning of the book, and it describes, well, we'll see. Let's see. Complicated. Now I can see and talk at the same time. The spot they reached, Lady Franklin Bay, a long and narrow penetration in the Ellesmere Island coast, was 1,100 miles north of the Arctic Circle and only 100 miles short of the top of the North American continent. Captain Pike had butted and wedged the Proteus through rotten ice up to 10 feet thick into an indentation of Discovery Harbor, rimmed by cliffs shooting well over 1,000 feet. Cascades of water thundered down the solid rock, splitting into smaller streams before plunging into the sea. In the harbor center sat a rugged island named Blot, by the British at summit snow-crested in mid-August. The ship, looking for a landing spot, turned to place this island on its starboard side while keeping Cairn Hill on the mainland to port. High on the hill, steep slopes, musk oxen grazed, while lower down, at a brook-fed open pool, a large flock of eider ducks splashed and flapped. The expansive shoreline was studded with rocks, the largest rivaling in size the motor launch Lieutenant Adolphus W. Greely had brought up in the Proteus for coastal exploring. These boulders, fallen from the cliffs since the commencement of time, presented a formidable obstacle to moving about this raw and unknown land. Back beyond, over the cliffs, the terrain steepened to mountains, revealing glaciated slopes where the ship dropped anchor below Proteus Point. Midsummer greenery flourished, sledges and grasses, clusters of purple flowering saxifrage, and patches of yellow Arctic poppies, but no trees, none at all. The light was constant, only dimming around midnight. In those first few days after landing, the men worked 16 hours of the 24, unloading the ship and beginning construction on their house. An army barracks was already framed, sitting solid on a stretch of level land. Its gable ends riding north and south, its long bank of windows facing east toward the sunrise and the sea. The Proteus had made several attempts to leave the harbor, but a storm from the east had driven in ice from Lady Franklin Bay, and though the ship had battered her way to Dutch Island, 2 miles from Proteus Point, she was forced back. She now lay nearly within hailing distance from the huddle of tents, giving the men a last opportunity to pen notes to be carried back home. They had arrived easily enough through seas that could wreck ships, the cross currents of Smith Sound, the turbulent Kane Basin, finally the long, narrow, ice-choked Kennedy Channel. These 25 men comprised only the 4th expedition to make it through the treacherous pack ice this far north. They were well prepared, pre-cut lumber, glass windows, 2 heating stoves, a cooking range, a boiler, and a bathtub. Lieutenant Greely was concerned about diet and hygiene. He wanted his men to be healthy and comfortable. So, who were these men? The purpose of the expedition was to collect meteorological data, and they were collecting 500, they were making 500 readings a day, like temperature, snow, or precipitation. They were actually doing ice cores, speed of wind, velocity, tide. They actually had something to measure the gravitational force that I don't really understand very well, but it was a giant instrument that weighed about 100 pounds. And that the role of that instrument comes in later for the used it to mark a particular point that they wanted to remember. But here they are. It was an army expedition, and most of the men were privates. They had been through the Indian Wars of the 1870s, and it was thought that that experience on the planes would have hardened him up for an Arctic trip, which basically nothing could have hardened him up for this trip. There was, let's see, one man here, Lieutenant Jewell. I think he's up here somewhere. And he actually, you probably know the Jewell Trail on Mount Washington. The trail was named for him. He actually did not survive the expedition. He probably had more Arctic experience being an observer on the top of Mount Washington in the mid-1870s than probably anyone on the expedition. So Lieutenant Greely is in the middle with a black beard. He went through the Civil War. He was 38 at the beginning of the expedition here. He had not gone to West Point, and that actually, I think that weighed on him. I think he lacked confidence to a certain degree because of that. I don't know what you call it, just I think it bothered him that he hadn't gone to West Point. But he had two lieutenants with him, Lieutenant Kissling-Berry and Lieutenant Lockwood. And they had a doctor, Dr. Pavey, who is right there. He actually was, this photograph was taken in Washington at the beginning, right before they left. And comes from the studio of one of the photographer, actually. And his name was George Rice, who turned out to be a real hero on this expedition. He was Canadian and from Cape Breton. It was a strange mix of personalities, and because of that, there actually was a fair amount of discord. The doctor, Dr. Pavey, was from a wealthy Creole family, and he had been educated in Europe. Part of his education was in Europe, and he did not like taking orders from Greely, who he regarded as, in a sense, blue collar. And actually, Greely was from a blue collar family. His father was a shoemaker. And the difficulty with this arrangement with the doctor was that he was not in the Army. He was contracted to the Army, and that meant that he was not under Greely's orders. He really didn't have to pay any attention to Greely. This is not a good situation, especially since they rubbed each other wrong. I mean, a real oil and water situation. The doctor liked to goad Greely, and a very unhealthy thing. Then they also had a private his name was Private Henry, and he's right here in the back. Actually, it was the biggest, weighed the most, was the tallest, and the strongest man on the expedition. A private, been through the Indian Wars. He had also forged his commander's signature for food, and he was finally caught. He was in prison. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He managed to escape after a year, at which point when he was in Deadwood, Montana, I think, not sure, he killed a Chinaman in a brawl, and somehow managed to escape the police, and modified his name And in other words, the same as Charles Henry Buck, and he changed it to Charles Buck Henry. and he enrolled in the Army again and ended up in Nebraska, and the man as commander and that where he was wrote to Greely and recommended Private Henry. Private Henry really wanted to go on this expedition, and so there was one man who suspected what Private Henry's background was. That's Sergeant Brainerd. Sergeant Brainerd is right over here. And I actually use him as my vehicle for telling the story. It's not in first person, but it's sort of third person looking over Sergeant Brainerd's shoulder. And but Sergeant Brainerd can't really do anything about what he thinks he knows, but he promises himself that he's going to keep a close eye on Private Henry. So Private Henry actually, well, I don't want to jump too far ahead of the story. So I'll read you actually a short reading, takes about 10 minutes, on what happened to Lieutenant Kislingberry. This happened right at the beginning of the expedition. And just as a little preface to this reading, on the ship up, Lieutenant Kislingberry shot a polar bear from the ship, and they got it up on the ship, and Kislingberry was thrilled, and he said, "I'm going to take this polar bear back to my 4 boys." And Lieutenant Greely said, "Not so fast. This is an expedition capture, and it belongs to the expedition." And Lieutenant Kislingberry was extremely irritated by this. Okay, so remember the polar bear story. "You are late, Lieutenant. They're having breakfast." Lieutenant Greely snapped, leaning over his pocket watch positioned before him on the breakfast table. By 20 minutes, Lieutenant Kislingberry had overslept on the boat coming up and continued to oversleep most mornings since. Greely had sent a man to wake him today. Today he would put an end to this officer's insubordination. "I would prefer to stay in bed and do without breakfast, sir," articulated the lieutenant. The man's crisp accent grated on Lieutenant Greely's ear. He sprang up, jostling the table. "Lieutenant Kislingberry," he pronounced in a voice he knew how to make carry, "I would willingly lose every officer and do my work with enlisted men alone, rather than have men disposed to question my orders." He swept up his watch and dropped it in his pocket. "Are you willing to continue on this basis?" While the superior was speaking, Kislingberry had sat down on the bench and helped himself to oatmeal, now congealed, from the bowl on the table. "I am not." His words emerged, separate and distinct. He was a good-looking, sandy-haired man with a trim mustache. Matters have gone too far. He stayed seated while he said this. Lieutenant Kislingberry had the advantage of his accent. Lieutenant Greely, topping out at 6 feet, the advantage of height. So the Englishman remained seated. Then I relieve you, Lieutenant, of your position on this expedition. Kisslingberry rocked back on the bench as though struck, but continued to masticate his cold oatmeal. You are excused, men, Greely addressed the table, aware that every eye was trained on him. There are the meteorological readings to take on the hour, and you are late. He ran a hand down his bushy black beard in a smoothing accent. It is past 8 o'clock. The beds must be aired, as today is Tuesday. Dishes cleared, washed, and put away, the floor swept, and the call boxes filled. He had taken off his spectacles to run his eyes down the table. Black eyes, soft, lustrous, and full of highlights. They were his best feature. He swerved on his left heel and strode in a military manner out of the common room, every eye fixed on his arrow-straight back. They had been here just 17 days. David Brainerd rubbed a hand across his freshly shaved chin. He had seen this coming. Their commanding officer had to nip insubordination if he were to hold his men, but Brainerd had his doubts about how Lieutenant Greely had handled this. Okay, after breakfast, the men are up on the roof, pounding in nails. Suddenly, Private Bender shouted, "Look, it's Lieutenant Kisslingberry. He's got a duffel." Brainerd looked up. So, Lieutenant Greely had followed through, and the lieutenant was too bound up in his pride to apologize. Two wrongs don't make a right. That's what he had learned at home on the farm, and in school too. They all watched the lieutenant running at breakneck speed, blasting through snowdrifts, falling over himself, his canvas gear bag clutching on the rocks, waving his free hand. "By God, he is trying to flag down the Proteus," Private Henry shouted. And they all started talking at once. He told the CO he was going to keep that polar bear pill. Shot it with his Remington given to him by the firm. Told us that 50 times. He just wants to get back to his boys. He never should have left them, Private Frederick said. He was their shortest man, with a quiet voice that always got their attention. "You're right, Shorty," Westward said. "God damn it, he never should have come up here." All work on the roof stopped as they watched Lieutenant Kisslingberry drop his heavy load and hurl himself forward. They lost him in a dip, but he appeared again, growing smaller until he reached Dutch Island, a rocky dot a full 2 miles away. But the Proteus was beyond Lieutenant Kisslingberry's reach, and the men on the roof went back to work. Now and then they glanced up to spot the lieutenant as he limped slowly back. He flung around to see what the ship was doing, but she only showed him her backside. When he reached his kit bag, he hoisted it and staggered. It seemed to Brainerd that poor Lieutenant Kisslingberry had taken up a weight too great to bear. "I'd say our Englishman is stuck, and stuck good," Private Connell said in a tone that betrayed his amusement at the lieutenant's misfortune. "Brought it on himself," Private Henry chuckled. "His timing's about as disastrous as General Custer's, leading his 7th Cavalry into the Indian trap at Little Bighorn." As he watched Lieutenant Kisslingberry struggle back, Sergeant David Brainerd was concerned that his commander's disciplinary action did not fit their situation. The word martinet had crossed his mind as a description for Greely's leadership. If that was what they were up against, a man's stripes were worthless, as the Englishman's case had proved. They were in an isolated world that was becoming colder and darker by the day. Brainerd hoped his commanding officer would see his error and ameliorate his actions to those appropriate to their situation. These men were trained fighters, while Greely's previous military experience had been the logistical laying out of telegraph lines. The situation at Fort Conger might call for a similar kind of leadership, but the men themselves had come from recent combat on the plains. Brainerd desperately hoped his CO could find his way with these men. So you might be getting the picture that here they are, these 25 men, very isolated. It couldn't have been more isolated. I think it's really hard for us to imagine that the kind of isolation they're in cannot be duplicated today. It's impossible. I mean, you could go up there without a satellite system or something, but there would be planes that could come over. I mean, it's just pretty stunning to think of that kind of isolation. And the way things had been set up in Washington before the expedition left. In other words, they had to plan for every contingency. So the idea was that after a year there, in other words, the next summer, they went up in 1881. The next summer, a relief would be sent up with more food and more men to relieve any of the ones who wanted to return. And so the men are waiting. You know, they've completed a year. They're waiting for the ship to show up. Probably in early August was when they thought it would be due. And the days go by. The ice flows out a little. They get encouraged. They think they're going to see the ship. The ice comes back in. The ice kept really toying with them, teasing them, going in and out. And it ended up that the ship didn't come up. It didn't come that year. So they prepare for a second winter. And they, it was a trying winter, as you can imagine, with Lieutenant Kislyberry. He had no duties at all. He was basically a non-entity. He began fraternizing with the privates, in other words, lowering himself, and he encouraged gambling. I mean, they only had cigarettes and they didn't really have any money, but they had food. And then that summer, the summer of 1882, and again, no ship. So now what are they going to do? They're facing a third winter. And the way it was worked out before Greely left, and Greely was a party to these plans. Greely had 3 or 4 open boats, actually at a launch, and he had 3 open boats. And he had the option of going down the Ellesmere coast. And, but they stayed, and they didn't leave until August 9th. And then, let's see here. This dotted line follows, I don't know how much you can see, but there's a dotted line that follows their route down. And when they get into the Cane Sea, they begin, they're very close. They wanted to get to Cape Sabin because they knew that there were that food could have been dropped off by those ships that came up for them there. There also could be food on the Greenland side. But and then there was food buried in canned goods. And so they're swept back up by the wind and the ice, and they make this zigzag pattern for about 5 weeks. And eventually, before they were swept into Baffin Bay, which basically would have been the end of them, they managed to get to Cape Sabin. And so now it's going into October, and they're really in a very bad spot. But they're all alive. I mean, they actually came through that sea voyage, which is really quite astonishing. And do you want to know what happened to the ships that came up? One of them just couldn't get really past Cape Sabin, and the fellow in charge was a private, and in other words, he didn't really have the authority. He wanted to leave all the rations that he had for Greely there at Cape Sabin, but he was ordered to take it all back. So he screwed up his nerve, and he left probably about a third of it, which might have fed 25 men for maybe 3 weeks, something like that. The second ship that came up in '82 was Lieutenant Garlington. Lieutenant Garlington was a West Pointer. He thought very well of himself. He had an outsized confidence and outsized opinion of himself. And so he didn't listen to the captain of the ship, who was in charge of sailing the ship, who said we should, they ran into ice, and Garland didn't want to just, bash his way through there. And the captain said, we need to wait. We'll get up there if they're very patient, let the ice recede a little bit. But Garlington wouldn't listen, and he actually managed to sink his ship. So that meant all the food for Greely went to the bottom. And Garlington had been ordered, his orders were that if he wasn't able to get up to Greely, then he needed to go over to the Greenland side. There was 30 miles in between Cape Sabin on the Ellesmere side and where actually the Eskimos, the Etah Eskimos, were on the Greenland side. And Garlington was to go over there and man a station and keep his eye on Cape Sabin, because it was thought Greely might do what he did, actually, and come down there. And but Garlington didn't do any of that. He actually retreated completely. And, in his boats there, I won't go into all the details, but there was nobody over on the Greenland side. And when Greely and his men got to Cape Sabin and realized they were going to be spending the winter there, they believed that Garlington was probably over there. So they pile rocks together to make like a hovel, basically. They roofed it with one of the boats. They threw a canvas over that, And all 25 of them move in. They line up in 2 rows facing each other. They have very little food, and they actually have begun to starve on the way down in the boats. So, let's see. Okay. We'll pick up the story where they've been trying to strategize how to get more food, and there was no game, basically. In the first place, it was winter, and apparently Cape Saban was pretty barren of game anyway. So, George Rice, who was the brother of the photographer who took their picture before they left, was a very, very noble man and very self-sacrificing. And he had agreed to go down to bring back a cairn that a British expedition had left. There was supposed to be 144 pounds of meat, and that would have been canned. It was probably in 4 different large cans. And Rice had agreed to do that, so to go and look for it and bring it back for them with 2 or 3 others. So the men are about to, they're waiting for Rice to get back. 8 days, he'd been gone for 8 days. 8 days later, the CO had the cooks hold off dinner in expectation of Rice's team bringing in the English meat. All day long, the men were saying, "Tonight, we dine like kings." He delayed dinner an hour and then had Long serve up an amount that looked more pitiful than ever. Tea and a few ounces of meat from a tin containing pork. A dog could down this in half a gulp, Private Henry commented. And this bit of hard bread, he held it toward them in his paw. It wouldn't fill the paw of a mouse. As they stared at the morsel, Lieutenant Lockwood began to talk. "I will tell you the things I will keep in my room at home for midnight eating," he said in the soft southern tones. He began to tick them off on his fingers. Sardines, potted ham, smoked beef, smoked goose, and eel, shrimp, anchovy paste, spiced oysters, stuffed olives, Boston pilot biscuits, buttered crackers. "Does your mother butter the crackers?" Bender inquired. "I've never had a buttered cracker." The others pounced on him to shut up, but the lieutenant continued, unaware of interruption, caressing each word. "Albert and Arundel crackers, soda and water, ditto ginger, nuts and cakes, can of butter and condensed milk, preserved peaches, strawberries, and blackberry jam, fromage brie, and Schweizerkäse. You Germans like that. Sugar, beer, ale, porter, and cider, and liqueurs, and Virginia seedling wine, mustard, vinegar, pepper, salt, and Maryland biscuit, black cake. Lieutenant Lockwood." "That will be enough." The CO's voice crashed down like a sledgehammer. Lockwood focused sorrowful eyes on his commanding officer and broke off his recitation. The CO picked up the Pickwick papers and began to read. He read aloud to them after supper and before sleep. A mournful time, when thoughts of home most depressed those who had homes. After the reading, they sat up in their bags waiting for the arrival of Rice, Shorty, Lynn, and Elson with the meat, even though they were best off if they could slide right into sleep after the reading, when they retained a remnant of food in their stomachs and so of warmth. The CO had left on the seal blubber lamp, and some of them were writing in their journals. Lieutenant Lockwood kept his in shorthand. That mark there, Charlie, diagonally across the aisle, pointed to it with a greasy finger. It's in all your entries. Does it concern the weather? That's how I begin my entries. That mark, as you call it, Private Henry, means memorandum. He looked around at this inquisitive private from where he was lying on his side in his buffalo bag, one mittened hand encircling his ink bottle in an attempt to keep it thawed. What do you make a memorandum of? Charlie asked. This question aroused Brainer's attention. The men discussed Lieutenant Lockwood. He came from a world most of them could not imagine, a refined world, a happy family home. He has no secrets, Private Henry said once. I'll read you one, the lieutenant replied, and turned back a few pages. Memorandum. Vienna Coffee House, Broadway and 14th Street, New York. Large assortment of cakes, bread and pastry, fine chocolate, omelets, and biscuit glacé. He flipped forward a few pages. Here's another from the Vienna Cafe. Roulades, Charlotte Russe, torts, roast suckling pig, Irish stew. He looked up. Every pair of eyes, sockets hollowed for lack of food, were fixed on them as if by magnetic attraction. We've discussed every dish under the sun, the lieutenant said. All forms of vegetables and desserts. Tonight we ate. He was not talking to them. He was talking to himself. A morsel of meat, I think it was pork. It's hard to distinguish taste now. And a little bread. A very, very little. It couldn't have satisfied a child. Tomorrow we will have the same. Or, if not precisely the same, it will taste the same. He made a waxing movement with his fingers toward his evergrown mustache that the men's eyes followed like obedient puppies. The CO stirred, about to cut him off, when every ear picked up the crunch of footsteps, a single pair of feet, and Rice fell through the canvas covering of their doorway. Happy to take questions.
That's a wonderful story. In preparing for this, did you go up to see Franklin Bay?
No. I didn't go anywhere near the Arctic. But I'll tell you what I did do. I mean, what prepared me to write about the conditions they were in was just 30 years of hiking in the White Mountains, in particular the Presidential Range. And strong wind, extreme cold, and the beauty of it is that we can go up on brutal days because all we need to do is stick our nose out and get thrashed around for an hour or two or three and go back down below tree line. So, you know, it actually can be handled very safely. So, yeah, I had no, people have asked me, like, why didn't you go up to the Arctic? And, you know, in a funny way, and I don't really know why this is the case, but I had no strong reason. I'll tell you, I think partly I would not have been seeing the situation that they were in. I would have been up there in the summertime, for starters, and I wouldn't have experienced that darkness. And I don't know.
The many characters, Laura, in your book. Do you have a favorite?
Did I have favorites of the men?
Yeah.
You bet. Yeah, I kind of fell in love with Private Brainerd. I'll see. So, tell me how you feel about him when you read it, Ernie. But also, they just, it was the men. I mean, they were so distinct as personalities, and each one just, and there was the whole spread. I mean, from Private Henry, who really had no heart. I mean, he stole food. He was obsessed with food. They all were, but he was obsessed with it in a very self-serving way. And he was not remorseful when confronted with the fact that he was taking food that belonged, to all of them. And I won't tell you what happened to him, but he basically deserved it. And, and then there was Brainerd, who, I don't know, you would want him on your team. I mean, people said that about Shackleton, but Brainerd had those qualities. He could get along with everyone. He was very fair. He actually was the one responsible for cutting up their food, for proportioning it out. I mean, 25 men, and they were eating about, 8 ounces of food a day. And then there was everyone in between. I mean, the doctor was not a nice guy. He was actually a very good doctor. But the interesting thing is that of the 6 men who came through, all but one of them had done basically all he could to help when they were starving. I mean, were true team players. And from what I've read, and probably you too have read about this, that if you're in a tough situation, if you are willing to help your fellow bedmate or whatever, I mean the people that you're in the expedition with, you have a better chance of surviving. If you're willing to come out of yourself and contribute to the team, you might, because of that attitude, you have a better chance of coming through. The irony here is that the Private Connell, who was actually not a very nice guy, did survive the expedition, but he was from Ireland, and he really, I don't know if he actually said it, I have him say it. It was the luck of the Irish that pulled him through.
I wonder how much of the characters, the actual who they were personality-wise, came from your research, and how much did you have to fill in?
I'd say, really everything came from the research. I could get a very good sense of what these men are like because I was working from their diaries, and in particular Brainerd's diary. He wrote he wrote every day for the entire length of the expedition, and including at Camp Clay. He never missed a day. And he actually is very honest, very forthcoming. You really get a good picture of what he's feeling, what he's trying to figure out, and what he thinks of Greely, and especially his extreme dislike for Private Henry. But those food entries came right out of Lockwood's diary. So, yeah, that was one of the great things about working on this book. I mean, was being able to know that, you know, these men, they were people. And I could learn what this experience meant to them by the diaries. Jenny?
Time for one more question.
Sorry?
One more question. Well, two more.
How many diaries survived? How many of them?
Probably bits of maybe, I don't know if it's all of them, but a lot. I didn't see all of them by any means, but in Greely, what Greely wrote after he came back from the expedition includes portions of a number of the diary entries. Can we do one more?
Yeah.
Laura, I'm wondering how you went about writing this book as compared to the other books that you've written, because this is sort of historical fiction, and what you've written in the past is quite different.
Laura, could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Thanks.
How I went about writing this book, since this is different from what I had written or what I had written before. It was an extremely strenuous learning curve. It was not easy, and it took me many drafts. I basically had no idea what I was doing. And I'd written short stories with some success back in the 90s, and that helped in a way, but yet it didn't help in another way, because this was a whole novel. And I finally began to get it, and but it took many, as I said, many drafts, and I think kind of the turning point for me was my agent and I began talking about that I needed someone to see the action through, or see the whole situation through, and we came up with Private Brainerd, Sergeant Brainerd being that vehicle, as I said at the beginning, that he's the third person over the shoulder. So, and maybe you picked up from the reading that I go back to him like he's watching Private Henry. You know, he's thinking about how how Sergeant Greely's acting, and that seemed to get me over a hump. And
One more. Go ahead, Sue.
You very distinctly called this a novel and not historical fiction. And I think a lot of people might be interested in why you made that choice.
to call it a novel and not historical fiction. Well, to me it is a novel. And I don't really, maybe I don't know how to define historical fiction, but I didn't make up any characters. But I can tell you why I wanted to write it as fiction. historical or not, was that, and this came, well, in the first place, there are several good nonfiction books on the Lady Franklin Bay expedition. And I had nothing to add to that. And I mean, I wasn't turning up any kind of original material that would be new. But what really interested me was the emotion, what these men were feeling, and that's what you can do with fiction. And I wanted to imagine, I wanted to set scene and write believable dialogue, and I wanted to put what I was learning from them through their own diary entries into the story. I mean, that's what was exciting about it for me. Thank you.
Thank you.